Hi, I'm James Woodcock from pixelrefresh.com and host of the Game and Gadget podcast. And here with me today I have Alex Brown, the programmer of a new upcoming Amiga game in 2024. Another Amiga game, it's fantastic. So this is called Metro Siege, and this title will also appear on modern platforms too. So thank you very much for joining me today, Alex.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So Metro Siege is essentially up to a two-player beat-em-up, but before we get into all the details, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up becoming a programmer.
Well, that's a long story. I guess my dad, who was a scientist in the 60s and 70s, used to bring computers home from his job. So I started playing with computers even before there were home computers. We used to play this game that you'd actually play the game on the computer printer. You would print out, and it was a skiing slalom game, and you would print the game. You'd control the joystick, the keyboard as this thing printed, and then at the end it would show you your score, and you'd tear off the little printer like a receipt printer, and you'd have the record of your game. It was awesome. So I used to love stuff like that, and then finally we got a 8-bit, which was a Micro-B, an Australian computer, with a Z80, and I started programming in BASIC with that. My dad taught me how to program, and we used to type in the games from the books where you had the basic games. But none of those worked on the Micro-B because they had all of the pokes to access the special. They'd have a section for Commodore 64. You have this poke, and for VIC-20, you have none of those worked on the Micro-B. So I had to work out what they did, which then got me a little bit into assembly language and how the CPUs worked and what the different systems could do and how they were different. And so then I started programming in Z80 on the Micro-B, and then finally we got the Amiga, and I got an action replay, and it was from there didn't look back.
So what were some of the favourite titles? You've mentioned one which sounds like quite a quirky print-out game, tear off, and there's your score. But what sorts of other influences? Was it purely the code and program aspect of it that really got you going, or was it the type of titles?
So on the Micro-B, my favourite game was, I think, a game called Emu Joust, which is a clone of Joust. I used to play it in monochrome, but it was really smooth on the Micro-B. It was a really good game, and it had great physics for an 8-bit. On the Amiga, all of the classic games that everyone loves on the Amiga were the games that I used to play. Speedball 2, Supercars, Turrican 2. Ironically, not many fighting games, but I guess that's because the fighting games on the Amiga weren't great, especially back then. But I used to, when Double Dragon came out at the arcade, my friends and I would live at those arcades playing Double Dragon. We played a lot of arcade games, Commando, Elevator Action. We used to play those before school. It was a
nice mix of different genres there for sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, the Amiga. I'm lucky enough to co-host this podcast with Tony Warren, who's one of the co-founders of Revolution Software. So he's got some expertise in the Amiga, to say the least, when we look at games like Beneath a Steel Sky and Lure of the Temptress. And his concern was always with the Amiga, it's got these custom chips. Not every Amiga is identical. If you look at the A500, the A600, and all the A1200, they've all got their targets. Now, Metro Siege seems to be targeting the Amiga A500. And then everything, but it's going to be on some modern platforms as well as that. It's just like people targeting the Mega Drive. It's got the Mega Drive aesthetic. It'll actually run on a Mega Drive, but you can also play it on modern platforms too. And that's essentially what's happening with Metro Siege, except for the Amiga. So in the nicest way possible, and look, I've got an Amiga right behind me, so I'm a fan of the Amiga, so you're in a safe space here. But why the Amiga?
Well, I guess everyone on the team loves the Amiga, so we all grew up with Amigas. I got into Amiga programming again in about 2015, 2016, where I released a couple of games with various artists, and just for fun. And although one of them's commercial, it wasn't really the motivation. There's not really a commercial side to producing games on the Amiga. Even the ones that are nominally commercial, they're not commercial in the sense that they don't cover the cost in any way of developing them. Maybe it covers you some coffees on the way to drop off the boxes at the post office or something, but that's about it. So Metro Seas is a passion project to show to see what we could do on the Amiga. Everyone on the team wants to know what sort of fighting game could we create on the Amiga 500, and so that's why love of the platform and the challenge, and also the Amiga has a great community as well that we love.
So, what is your day job then? If this is a passion project, what's your day job? What actually funds to be able to do this passion project in a sense?
Yeah, I am a programmer as well, not a games programmer. I develop, big websites, web applications. It's my day job, but my background professionally does have a lot of embedded programming. So there's a lot of techniques that I learned in my professional career that helped with the development of Metro Siege.
Just less
Right
Amigas,
now,
I imagine.
yeah.
So, what can you actually tell us about Metro Siege and some of the features we can expect? Because I've been lucky enough to play the demo, which is available on the website, and I downloaded the beta version as you suggested. And my A500 has a PyStorm in it, but I'm sure it'd run absolutely fine on a stock A500 as long as you've got the extra memory card in it. But it looks like you're really pushing it to its full capabilities. But what is other than it being the target platform, what are you really trying to get out of the system? What sort of limits are you pushing as hard as you can?
Well, we push every limit. It's a constant struggle with Metro Siege to try and fit the game in 1 MB of RAM and to manage to maintain a good frame rate on a 7 MHz CPU. We use as much of the hardware and the hardware features as we possibly can. You previously mentioned that the Amiga, there's so many different configurations that everyone has, so it's a real struggle to try and maintain compatibility. But Metro Siege also does. So there are two versions of the game. There's the Amiga 500 version that you downloaded that runs off floppies. The version that runs on the hard drive, it cooperates with the operating system, and the reason it does that is because we're going to be releasing, hopefully, if it works, a version that allows network co-op, and this is going to be from real Amigas. So my son and I have played network co-op from Amiga to Amiga. In addition to that, you'll be able to do network co-op between Amiga and modern platforms as well. So that's something probably quite unique, I think, that you'll be able to join up with your friend who doesn't have an Amiga and they can play it on their Windows machine or on a web version, and you can play network co-op on your Amiga.
Wow, so true cross-system play then, potentially.
That's something that's relatively unique to the Amiga. And a challenge as well. We'll see if it's looking good. We're probably going to do a demo release of that soon, hopefully, if we think it's going to be stable enough for the general public to sort of use it without it being too frustrating or too buggy or too laggy. So that's another thing.
That's a good thing about betas, isn't it? You can put it out there with some sort of caveat and say, look, we want to show you this new feature. It's not finished yet, but your feedback is going to be helpful to finalising this title. So hopefully people will understand that and get involved and give some really good feedback that will help the design of the game.
Well, it's already happened. So when we released this we called the technical preview, because we didn't want people to think this was a demo as such of what the game was going to be like. This is the engine. This is what it's going to basically how it's going to function. This is the speed that it's going to be. These are the moves. But we haven't finished the game. The balance of the game has not been finalized. The levels haven't been finalized. The enemy AI is still a work in progress. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to move forward from that. So this is not here's the first 3 levels that you're going to get when the game is finished. This is have a go. We think it's pretty fun. The 3 levels that we released. And we thought people would get a kick out of it. But also, we have already found bugs that we didn't know about that people have helped us track down. And we've validated that it's pretty compatible, which has been positive for us. On the most part, people have used it on all different kinds of machines and with great success. So that's been positive. So we've got a lot of feedback that we're processing. Things that people like, things that people didn't like. We're not going to fix everything that every single person didn't like, but we can get a feel and we can see where it sits, and we're pretty happy with generally the response so far.
That's really good, and certainly my first impressions are like, flipping out, this is running on an Amiga A500. I mean, it's pretty spectacular, and I've played a lot of A500 based titles, and some games push the hardware more than others. But this one, particularly we've been in a beat-em-up genre where you've got aiming for 2 players simultaneous and then having all the enemies on screen as well. That must have limitations and how many you can have on screen at once, and then all the decision making that goes with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the configuration that we have with the sort of 4 enemies on screen at the same time is about as much as we can do at the frame rate on an A500. Some levels have different types of configurations because of different things going on. I don't want to do too many spoilers, but generally we make sure that the game is on an A500. It's going to be relatively smooth with no dropped frames in most of the time. And that's a challenge because every level in Metro Siege is quite different. You'll notice that the train level looks very different to the opening level, and it's almost like they're 2 games the way that they're programmed. It's almost like they're 2 completely separate games. The tech that's used to create that train level is quite different to how most games work. It was a challenge to get that going, but it was fun, and the results are sort of good. Like people are we were a bit worried that maybe we wouldn't be able to make it visually as solid as we wanted using that technique, but no one seems to have noticed, and people seem to think that it looks pretty good, so we're happy with that. And we've got some other levels further on in the game that do similar kind of different things, so there's going to be some interesting visuals that people get to see, that's for sure.
Well, certainly from those few preview levels in the beta, it looks really impressive, and it runs at a really good frame rate, and there's parallax scrolling on top of all of that as well, so you got stuff in the foreground moving at different speed to stuff moving in the background at a different speed, and while you're fighting the enemies, there's trains moving and all sorts happening. So it really feels like this is the Amiga at its best. But what are some of the tricks you've had to employ to be able to do all these things? Do you think a game would have been able to be created back in the day like this if they'd had the time, or do you think it's the accumulation of knowledge of people for years experimenting what you can do with an Amiga?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Michael Parent, I guess he's the godfather of Metro Siege. It was his baby from the beginning, and his background is in professional game development. He's a pixel artist. And he conceived the concept of wanting to. Unlike me, he's a brawler, hardcore brawler fan, and his whole life has been brawlers. So he has very strong ideas about what he wants, and he wants this game to be the perfect brawler that he has always wished could exist, and to prove to himself that we could do it on the Amiga. And so he had a very strong idea of the kinds of effects he wanted to be able to achieve, and he's got a good understanding of the Amiga hardware as well. So we worked together quite closely, spitballing ideas to see, how could we achieve this effect in a way that would still let us get a good frame rate? Because you can do amazing things with the Amiga. Obviously, we look at the demos and stuff that are out there, and a lot of the games as well, and it's mind-blowing stuff. But a lot of those demo effects are not really viable for a game for some of the reasons you mentioned. You've got to do enemy AI and collision detection and all sorts of other stuff. So You can't.
And you're not interacting with the demos, you're just watching something very gorgeous and it sounds amazing, but it's basically just running and you're not touching it at all.
Yeah,
the game, you're touching it all the time.
And Mike has a background in mobile development for the brief period before sort of everything turned 3D in mobiles, and they used to use a technique on the smaller devices called modular animation, and that's what we employ in Metro Siege. So in Metro Siege, each of the we'll call them sprites, but they're not hardware sprites, but each of the player characters, it's not a single image per frame. It's comprised of lots of small images that are put together with position information to make up the characters. And what that gives us is, from a RAM point of view, we get a lot more potential character positions than would be the case if it was just larger composites. And that technique was used to some degree back in the day, in that you look at some of the sprite sheets from some fighting games, and they are made up of semi-modular, I guess, pieces, but I don't think anything's done it to the extent that Metro Siege has. So, we've got tooling. So Eric Hogan, I don't know if you've heard of the system called Scorpion Engine. That's a game maker for Amiga and other retro platforms, and he developed for us a tool that allows us to do this modular animation very easily. So that's been an awesome. I would have had to create something myself, but he did it for us. So he's been an amazing contributor to this project as well. But when you say could it have been done back in the day, probably. But I suspect the amount of time that we've spent on this game versus the sort of commercial realities that they would have had back then, I think they would have struggled both from an art point of view and the engine. So we're free to spend as much time as we want. We don't have to get something out in 6 months, otherwise we miss Christmas. So we don't really tend to compare Metro Siege or other games with stuff done back in the day because, well, for starters, we've got much better, faster computers, better compilers, much better tooling in general, and we don't have these commercial realities hanging over our heads. So it's not really a fair comparison.
You don't want the developer crunch at the end of the project.
I'm sure. I mean, a lot of the coders in those original games were amazing, and you can see, the work they did was crazy, and they did it in very short time frames. So if some of those guys used modern tools today, they'd probably do something even better.
Well, I'm hoping you're getting lots of enjoyment out of the process, and it is truly a passion project. And certainly from the results of that beta, it looks truly amazing. I'm really looking forward to how this progresses and watching its development, not just seeing what would become, I guess, the final title, because it's showing what people in the Amiga community, such as yourself, are bringing to this platform all these many years, not just after its release, but after it was stopped production. And I think this is what sometimes people forget. Yes, it was released. Then there was the point of when production was stopped. And there's huge gap, and there's waves of interest in any platform, no matter what it is, of, oh yes, everyone's talking Amiga, then everyone's talking Mega Drive, or whatever it may be. And then you get these nice base communities surrounding each one. And there's lots of, thankfully, intermingling between different communities. Because back in the day, I didn't have an Amiga. I actually had an Acorn Archimedes. I was the weird kid who went for the Acorn and the green keys of the function buttons, which look very nice and very appealing, and the draw of 32-bit. But I love that computer, and it was only sort of in the last few years I got a better appreciation for the Amiga. I was very lucky at the time. My best friend over the road back in the day had the Amiga A600, so I still got my hands on the Amiga and what it could do, and it always had a much bigger game library than my poor Acorn Archimedes could ever achieve. But it just shows you that these platforms, thanks to people like you, Alex, still have life. And that's fantastic. And the fact it runs on a real Amiga, rather than just being Amiga inspired, and you're kind of targeting, I don't want to say the limitations, a better word might be the intrinsic hardware capabilities, is probably a nicer way of putting it, for the Amiga. So you've actually got it running on an A500, but you have, I guess, had to make a small concession where you actually just need that expansion of the extra 512k memory. What does that extra 512k memory actually give you as a programmer that makes it possible where not having that, it wouldn't be?
So, well, I mean, we use 512k purely for graphics and sound. So the chip RAM in the Amiga is 100% filled on that A500 once that disk's booted up with graphics and sound, and the other is for code and data structures. So, if we were to try and fit it in 512k, then the game would be half what it is. It wouldn't be feasible to do it. And there's some games, I think it's Double Dragon 2 maybe on the Amiga, that does run in 512k. And it shocks me how well they've done to make that game fit in such a small amount of RAM. One of the things that I use a C compiler for a lot of the code in Metro Siege, and it produces fairly big code. If it was hand-coded in assembly, I'm sure, especially by some of the gurus who have been around since the 80s doing nothing but coding 68k assembly, they would be able to make the code in Metro Siege much smaller than it is. But, when this is a passion project and working part-time, it's not really feasible for me to do a project as big as Metro Siege in assembler. And the other advantage of doing it in C is that it actually quite easily ports to the modern platforms.
So what sort of documentation is there for the Amiga if you hit a bit of a roadblock? Are the people you naturally sort of drift to have a chat with and get some inspiration? Or is it like great websites you use? Or is it just a lot of experience and pulling it all together?
Yep, so the English Amiga board, EAB, if you're willing to search back through the history and the posts on that site, it's got an insane amount of information about the Amiga and programming the Amiga. It's, I would say, probably the best resource on the net. But as well as that, the Amiga dev community is relatively, most of us sort of know each other, and so we do communicate with each other on Discord and on Facebook and that sort of stuff. So if you do have problems, absolutely, there's people that we reach out to. As well as that, the actual hardware is well documented. The Amiga hardware reference manual is available online. And the Amiga hardware is not overly complicated. It does have some quirks that you need to be aware of. But it's not insanely complicated that you can't sort of make a start. Especially if you've got expertise in embedded development, where sort of what it means to write to a hardware register and get a result, sort of thing. So look, there's a lot of and there's Photon has a whole bunch of YouTube videos on programming the Amiga in assembly language. They're awesome. They're really helpful for people who are getting started. And he starts very simple and works his way up to a really cool demo. So yeah, there's heaps. There is a lot of stuff out there, absolutely.
And is there many, from all this knowledge and documentation and videos, is there what I guess class as tricks of the trade of the Amiga, where you're not necessarily following the official approach to get the best out of it, you're using sort of a sidestep and a slight trick to get that little bit more out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess games on the Amiga are 100 tend to be 100% sort of just going straight to the hardware, so they're all doing it the wrong way, in the sense that I guess Commodore probably originally maybe would have hoped that people would use sort of more system-friendly methods that would have made the Amiga more compatible if they changed the underlying hardware. But that's when the Amiga came out. That's not how games were written. people went straight to the hardware, and that's on any platform, and that's how they continued. So that has continued today. The hard drive version of Metro Siege is, I said it's sort of compatible with the operating system, but it still directly accesses the hardware. It just tries its best to reserve it from the operating system first. Um, you mentioned sort of the knowledge. There's a lot of tricks that have been sort of, I guess, possibly they were known by a select few back in the day, that are more widely known. Sort of, we have these sort of repeating sprite backgrounds. So in Metro Siege on level 1, you'll see that the far background layer there's some sort of light blue buildings, and that's 2 sprites that are just repeated across the screen using the copper. That's a technique that's sort of become much more popular recently. Was used a lot back in the day, but not probably as widely known how to do it until recently, where sort of people figured out how to do it, and it's quite common, I guess, now with new productions. The Scorpion engine that I mentioned before, you can load that up without any programming knowledge and create a little Amiga program that will do that almost automatically for you. So that's awesome.
And what does the development flow actually look like for working on an Amiga? I mean, back in the day, it would have been, here's a floppy disk, chuck the floppy disk to somebody, they'd put it in, test it, throw it back. And these are stories that Tony Warren has told me. But in terms of modern day Amiga programming, what is the thing you're actually programming on? And then you test it in Amiga. How does that bit work?
Yeah, so there's good tools now. So, I mean, I use a Mac, and I, build the game using a C compiler and a 68,000 assembler, and then fire it straight up in an emulator. But there's some people on Windows, and this tool came out after I started Metro Siege, but there's a version of, there's a development system that comes built in with a C compiler and the emulator built in, and you run that emulator straight out of a code editor, and it has a built-in debugger which gives you all sorts of awesome profiling information and that sort of stuff. So that sort of stuff probably would have been a dream to people back in the day, where they've got source line debugging in this emulator, as well as information about DMA usage and all this other sort of stuff. Like, it's insanely good and easy compared to how it would have been in the day. And it's so fast. You can make a change and then you can be testing it a few seconds later. Whereas, as you said, maybe back in the day you had to build it. It would have been slow to build. Maybe copy it to a floppy, boot it up on the Amiga, wait a minute maybe for a big game to load. It didn't work, start it again. Whereas now you can run the emulator in warp mode. The compiler will take a couple of seconds at most, and then the turnaround is super fast. So it's the tools are just insanely better than they would have been back in the day.
And how close do you think that emulation is to the real hardware? Do you ever get a point where, it's running fine in the emulator, and then you get on the Amiga and, oh, no, this isn't working?
Look, it's pretty good now, especially for the A500 the WinUAE core. I don't want to say it's perfect, but it's as close to perfect as I could imagine. There are some quirks. During my game development, I've actually run across a few situations where I had something working on an emulator and I put it on the real machine and it didn't work. And a couple of those I've actually, reported to the WinUAE developer who fixed it, improved the emulation. But that was quite a few years ago now, and it's come a long way since then. Even I wouldn't say a long way, because it was awesome before that, but there's been minor fixes, and especially on the non-AGA machines, where it's a much more known quantity and you don't have as many differences with CPUs and stuff. I think the emulation is really good. There are some scenarios maybe where it will work on an emulator and not on the real thing, but it might be to do with the state of the RAM when the machine boots up versus the emulator, and if you don't have initialized variables or something like that, it won't work. But in general, the emulation now is awesome, so it's really good.
That's good to know. And then how many people are actually involved in this project?
Well, yeah, so there's Michael Parent and Corey from Bitbeam Canon, and so Michael, as I said, he's the godfather of Metro Siege, and he's the we'll call him the art director. And most of the sort of level design and overall character design is his. But he then works with Corey on the art. So Corey has played a part so far, not a massive part. A lot of the art's being done by Michael. I think Corey did the logo and Officer Bob, which is an awesome character. Really can't get enough of him. And then we have John Chikaris from Pixel Glass, who's done the music as well as not an insignificant amount of the art as well. So we've got a 3-person creative team. And then, not officially on the team, but a big part was, as I said, Eric with the retro animator. And then when it comes to code, it's just me.
So a very small team with a very impressive result already. So that's really impressive. But have you all got a grasp of what is technically possible on the Amiga? So you have not having the discussions. So I imagine an artist creating this really impressive thing, and you're the programmer going, how am I meant to incorporate this in the game? This is far too elaborate. It's far too complicated. I need to send this back and have a nice diplomatic conversation with that person. How does that look in terms of the workflow?
Yeah, so look, as I said, luckily Michael and John have got a good background in the Amiga, especially John. So John's doing some other projects as well. He and I worked together on a game called Worthy, which released, I think, in 2018 maybe. And he did all the art and music for that as well as the level design. And so he got a good idea of sort of a general feel of what was possible on the Amiga back then. And he's gone on to continue to work on Metro Siege, but also he's doing a project called Grind that you probably heard of, which is the sort of new Doom-alike version of a first-person shooter for the Amiga. So he's got a really good feel for what's possible, and Michael's got a very strong background in the Amiga and what is possible. But even having said that, a lot of the time we don't know because it's a balance between the other competing factors. How it's all about number of sort of DMA slots you've got per frame, and that's going to be eaten up by sprites or bleeding objects or the CPU. And so is some harebrained scheme possible? Well, normally we give it a try and find out, and sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it isn't, but then we find a way to make a compromise with something else that makes it possible. So it's iterative.
And what would you say has been the biggest challenge so far in terms of programmatically getting it all to work? Is it like one element where you've been scratching your head thinking, I just can't get this to work at the minute?
It hasn't really been too much of that. It's, optimizing the memory usage is just an ongoing battle, and everything can always be made better. But it can be very tedious trying to find ways to optimize things to use a little bit less RAM, so you can squeeze a little more functionality in. You're looking at the way you've done stuff and trying to think, is this the most efficient way to do it, or do I need to store all that information? Or that the challenge for that is, I guess, that it's not super exciting. You don't really see any great. When we first started this project, Michael sent across the animated character of Alex in his idle pose, and I saw that and I thought, this is cool. And so I wrote a little tool to convert the animation format into something that we could display in them. And the next day, we literally had a little picture of Alex in his fighting pose, running on an Amiga, and that's great because you put some work in and you see something. Doing sort of refactoring some code for a week so that you can get 5 kilobytes of extra RAM. At the end of it, you don't really have anything. So I guess the motivation there is the challenge, but that's the hardest thing, is constantly looking for ways to squeeze more functionality into the RAM available.
And that must be hard because it's not like a week's worth of work. There's nothing dramatically changing visually on the screen. So if you maybe sent out a patch to a beta to another beta that's got this slight improvement in the RAM usage, probably no one's going to notice, but you've got more resources available to take advantage of. It's better optimized. But the gamer perspective, we're all oblivious to this. We're just in playing and enjoying the game. We haven't thought about these little bits of RAM you're trying to get the best out of the machine.
Yeah, absolutely. And like in the one of the demos, one of the betas that we released in the demo, that I changed a little bit, not massively, but just a little bit, the way that the joysticks are read, and that was done not to make the demo better, but such that the network version is going to be more able to stay synchronized when things like menus are pressed in game and that sort of thing. So it's one of these things where the people who were trying this demo, and it actually introduced some bugs. So people are like, hang on, this demo doesn't work as good as the last one. And I was like, okay, because there was a little bit of a rewrite behind the scenes for something that will hopefully be cool down the track. But so that definitely happens.
And was there any sort of desire at any stage to go, it's just too many limitations on the A500, or constraints, shall we say? Let's target the A1200 because we've got more colours and more capabilities? Or was it, this is the machine we love, this is the one we're going for?
No, absolutely. We haven't ever wavered. I mean, there's a desire, absolutely, to do an A1200 version. Whether that's the next thing we do, I don't know. Time will tell. We'll finish this one first, but it would be absolutely cool to have another version with less limitations. Probably more likely we would see a less limited version on modern platforms. At the moment, the modern version is pixel perfect. It's exactly the same. It runs at the same frame rate. The images are identical. The sound is, for all intents and purposes, identical. But it'll be very easy, obviously, to have more colors or a wider screen on a modern version. We might do that, but our primary focus is the Amiga version. That's the number one focus.
And that's what makes it not just great as a game, if we take the whole platform out of it, not just a great game, but it's great because it's an Amiga game. It just gives it that little bit of extra icing on the cake, that you've gone to the extra effort to make it run on this beautiful, albeit quite aged platform now, and all its constraints, we'll stick with the word constraints rather than limitations. And you've got this really good output from it so far, but there must be an end goal here. Is there kind of set in your heads that this is going to have, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 levels, and it's going to have these characters? How does the project of a dream sort of passion project go, where you make sure there's definitely an end to this? I've got other things I want to do as well.
Look, without giving too much away, the levels are very well planned out, and we've got a lot of other levels that are very far progressed, other than what's in the demo. Mike and Corey regularly do sort of planning for how the levels are going to play out, what the story is going to be, and what the characters are going to be in each level, and which sort of effects we're going to go for in each level. I think we've currently got something like 12, it might even be 13 levels, because there's one level that's sort of duplicated. So we've already got quite a lot of levels, and that's almost to the end. I can't remember the exact final number of levels. But yes, no, there's a definite plan for how the game's going to be finished. We plan on getting it finished. We can't give a time frame because it's a hobby project, really. It's a side project for everyone. Everyone's day jobs and families have to come first. But whenever we get capacity, it's something that we all love to work on.
Yes, for goodness sake. I mean, I'm sure we'd all love to know this is coming out this year, next year, 2026, whatever it may be, because we're excited. But then the pressure starts, doesn't it? And that passion project idea of it then becomes more of a stress and a difficulty. And maybe the hair tearing out part. And then it becomes more like trying to release a proper title, in the sense of it's going to retail, it's got to be out by Christmas, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it might seem strange, but the main reason we're developing is for ourselves. We want it to be a game that people can play and enjoy. But almost when we decided to write this game, it was more about let's write the game than let's create a product. This is, as I said, especially for Michael, this is the game. And, it's one of these things. So, Metro Siege has some stuff in it that's relatively unique and different for brawlers in general. Some people are noticing that it is a bit different in some of the ways that the controls work. And obviously some people are going to take issue with that because it's different to what they're used to and it's not following the norm. But we think that there's, and without giving too much away about what the final version will be like, we're hoping that, ignoring the fact that it's on the Amiga, that Metro Siege is just going to be an awesome game to play, and that people will enjoy it even playing it without necessarily caring about the limitations of the Amiga. My son plays it and he loves it, and he doesn't really know anything about retro computers that aren't Nintendo. So, that's a good sign.
Yeah, exactly. And again, from my own experience, not to keep going on about this, but if you take the Amiga platform out of it completely for a minute, it's already in beta. It's a good, fun, enjoyable beat-em-up game that brings a lot of nostalgic memory from that wonderful genre back, and that's a wonderful thing. But like I say, the fact it's targeting an Amiga A500, of which there's still a loyal fan base out there with authentic original A500s. Maybe they're doing it on FPGAs like the Mister, or they're doing it through the emulators that are available. There's still a vast audience out there that will appreciate that you are doing this for the Amiga platform. But in its own right, I think it's going to be a great game as well if you continue the way you are. So congratulations on what you've managed to achieve on this passion project so far. I'm very looking forward to seeing what comes next. Do you think there's going to be further betas until the final release, or how's that going to work?
Absolutely, there is. We had the reason that we released the demo was we wanted to, as I said, we wanted to get a feel for how compatible it was. Because if it was really crashing on people, we knew that we'd have to do a lot more work, and we did find some new issues, but in general, that's been pretty good. We wanted to see how people played it. There's a lot of YouTube videos already of people playing it, and we watched those, and we use that to help us work out how we're going to tune the balance of the game. Because it's interesting to see. Obviously, you've got skilled brawler people who can fly through that demo with barely losing a life. But then you've also got people who maybe aren't so skilled at brawlers in general, and they struggle to get through the first level. So we need to make sure that the game's going to be fun for people of different skill levels. So that's been really helpful for us to watch people playing it. And then the last reason we did it is just because we thought people would enjoy it and have fun. And we'd had it sitting there for a while and we hadn't made much progress. And then recently we got back into it and made some sort of big strides in reliability. And so we sort of thought, well, this is actually at a point now where it's probably reliable enough that people could give it a go. So then we decided to put out the demo. But having said that, there's some other things that we're going to be releasing. So we're going to be doing probably soon, hold your breath, maybe days, not weeks, there's going to be a version that runs on the web. So people who don't have Amigas can play it. And that'll be the same demo, but you'll just be able to play it on the web. And then after that, the next thing we'll release will be network play, network co-op. And that will work for real Amigas that have got networking and the web version as well. So people will be able to play Amiga versus web, or Amiga versus Amiga, or web versus web. And then after that, look, there's some changes that we've made based on feedback from the demo. So there's sort of changes to the demo. The other one that we'll probably release is the AI option. So you can play, if you're by yourself, you can get the computer to play Player 2 for you. That's something that we've sort of had that we've had for a long. We use it for testing mainly, but people sort of like to be able to play 2-player even if they're by themselves, and we didn't really have a way to turn that on in the user interface, so we knocked something like that up. So we've got, and that's just the short term. So we've got quite a lot going to be coming in the next few weeks/months, and then maybe it might go quiet for a bit while we put our heads down and start working on new levels. But we'll see.
It's all very exciting. Thank you so much, Alex, for your time for joining us on the Game and Gadget podcast. Where can we find out more about this title?
So probably, if you want the most up-to-date info, probably our Discord, the Metro Siege Discord. If you play the demo or check the README, I think there's an invite to that. And we will be doing some more updates to the Metro Siege website where people can find info. But I would say English Amiga board as well. We post updates there. But for the most up-to-date, if you really want to find out what's going on with the project, the Discord's the place to be.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Alex. You take care of yourself.
Thank you very much.